some people say the worst decisions are made in desperation. I used to think that was just something people told themselves to feel better about their mistakes. I was wrong. My name is Sophia Chen. 3 months ago, I made a decision that would change everything. But to understand how I ended up sitting across from the most dangerous man in New York, I need to take you back to the beginning. To my father, to a debt I shouldn't have paid, to the moment I chose darkness over everything I'd built. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were my favorite. Court was usually light. I could actually leave the office before midnight, and I'd treat myself to Vietnamese food from the place on 5th. But that Tuesday, the envelope with my father's lawyer's return address killed my appetite entirely. Inside was news about my father's estate. Estate, what a generous word for what my father left behind. Thomas Chen had been a gambling man, not the sophisticated type who played poker in penthouse suites. No, my father preferred underground games in Chinatown basements, the kind where you either paid your debts or disappeared. He disappeared 3 years ago. I'd assumed he'd finally run from his problems. Turns out, the problems caught up with him first. The letter informed me otherwise. He was dead, had been for 2 years. And his debts, those were very much alive. $375,000. I read that number 5 times, each time hoping I'd misunderstood. As a junior associate at a corporate law firm, I made decent money. But this was insurmountable. Here's what I should tell you about my father. He wasn't always like this. When I was 7, he'd wake up early every Saturday to make pancakes. Not just any pancakes, elaborate ones shaped like animals with chocolate chip eyes and berry smiles. He'd sit with me while I ate, asking about school, about my friends, about the books I was reading. Present, attentive, whole. My mother died when I was 12. Cancer, fast and brutal, 3 months from diagnosis to funeral. That's when everything changed. The gambling started slowly. A poker game here, a sports bet there. Ways to not think about the empty chair at dinner. Ways to feel something other than grief. By the time I left for college, he was barely recognizable. The man who made Saturday pancakes had been replaced by someone who called at 2 in the morning asking for money he swore he'd pay back. I'd stopped answering those calls my junior year. Part of me wanted to let his debts die with him, to tell whoever was calling that Thomas Chen's failures weren't my responsibility, that I'd mourned him years before his actual death. But another part, the part that remembered patient homework help and birthday, surprise parties, and a father who'd loved me fiercely before grief destroyed him, couldn't. I owed him something, maybe not $375,000, but something. My phone rang before I could fully process the decision. Unknown number. The voice on the other end was smooth, almost pleasant. A man named Marco, calling on behalf of someone my father knew quite well. We needed to meet, he said. Tomorrow at 8 p.m. Vesper on West 52nd. I should come alone. I tried to argue, tried to explain that legally I wasn't responsible for my father's gambling debts. That debts died with the debtor unless. Marco cut me off mid-sentence. His voice hardened just slightly, like steel wrapped in silk. We weren't in a courtroom, he reminded me. Tomorrow, 8 p.m., come voluntarily or they'd come to me. My choice. The line went dead. I sat there in my apartment, holding the letter, thinking about the father who used to exist, about a man who'd been good once, about the daughter who couldn't save him but maybe could honor what he'd been before the fall. I spent the next 24 hours researching everything I could find. Debt collection, organized crime, my rapidly diminishing legal protections. The law was clear. I wasn't responsible for my father's gambling debts. But Marco had been right about one thing. We weren't in a courtroom. And somewhere in my grief-tangled logic, I'd already decided I was going to that meeting. Chapter 2, Vesper. Vesper was the kind of restaurant that didn't have prices on the menu. The kind where a bottle of wine cost more than my monthly rent. I'd walked past it 100 times and never once considered going in. The hostess smiled when I gave my name, like I was expected, like this was normal. She led me past the main dining room, through a hallway lined with expensive art, to a private room in the back. The man sitting at the table wasn't what I expected. He was young, maybe 35, 40 at most, dark hair, perfectly tailored suit, and eyes that assessed me with the precision of a jeweler examining a diamond. Calculating value, finding flaws. There was an intelligence in his face that unsettled me more than any display of violence could have. I remained standing when he gestured to the chair across from him. I wasn't responsible for my father's debts, I told him. Legally, I had no obligation. He tilted his head slightly, studying me with those calculating eyes. Then he suggested I sit down. I'd had a long day, he said. Something in his tone made me obey. Not fear exactly, authority, the kind that came from never being questioned. He introduced himself as Dante Russo. He ran certain business operations in the city. He said it like he was discussing imports and exports, not whatever he actually controlled. My father had borrowed money from him to cover gambling losses, promised to pay it back with interest, didn't. I knew, I told him, my father was dead. He offered condolences that sounded more like a formality than sympathy. But the debt remained, he explained, $375,000 plus 3 years of interest. He'd round down to $500,000 out of respect for the deceased. The number hit me like a physical blow. I didn't have that kind of money. He knew, he said calmly. He'd reviewed my financials, junior associate, student loans, rent in Murray Hill. I was barely breaking even. The fact that he'd investigated me should have terrified me. Instead, I felt oddly exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with money. He poured wine into 2 glasses, something red and probably obscenely expensive. Then he laid out my options. 1, pay the debt. We both knew that was impossible. 2, work it off. Work it off doing what I asked. What I did best, he said, law. That caught me off guard. He explained that his businesses operated in gray areas. He needed someone who understood how to navigate legal complexities, corporate structures, contract law, asset protection. I would provide legal consultation, and he'd consider a portion of my father's debt forgiven with each job. So he wanted me to be his lawyer, I said. No, he corrected. He wanted me to be his problem solver. There was a difference. I asked what would happen if I refused. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something cold. Then he'd be forced to collect the debt through other means, he said. My apartment, my assets, my salary. He could make my life very difficult. Or, he pushed one of the wine glasses toward me. I could be smart about this. Work with him for a year, maybe 2, clear the debt, walk away clean. I stared at the wine glass, at him, at the choice that wasn't really a choice. I asked what kind of legal work. Nothing that would compromise my bar license, he said. He wasn't asking me to break the law, just bend it occasionally. My career at the firm would continue normally. This would be outside work, discreet, contained. The promise was clear. This wouldn't touch my real life. I could keep both worlds separate. I thought about my father, about the man he'd been before grief broke him, about owing something to that memory, even if the debt itself was unjust. I picked up the wine glass, took a sip. It was excellent. I asked about the first job. Dante smiled. It was a dangerous smile, the kind that made me wonder what I'd just agreed to. But he'd known I was smart, he said. We would start tomorrow. Chapter 3, the first job. The next evening, a car picked me up from my office. Not a taxi, a black Mercedes with tinted windows and a driver who didn't speak. We drove to a warehouse in Red Hook. Not the trendy, converted kind, but the actual industrial type that smelled like rust and river water. Dante was waiting inside, along with 2 other men. One was Marco, the voice from the phone. The other was older, heavier, with scars that suggested a violent history. Dante thanked me for being punctual, then gestured to a table covered in documents. They had a situation, he explained. He was acquiring a commercial property in Tribeca. The current owner was reluctant to sell. He needed me to review the contracts and find a legal way to force the sale. I scanned the documents, confused. This was straightforward real estate law. Why did he need me? Because the owner had connections, he explained. Political ones. This acquisition needed to be airtight. No room for legal challenges, no publicity, no complications. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing everything. The property was valuable, probably worth 3 times what Dante was offering, but the owner had violated several zoning codes, had unpaid tax liens, and most importantly, had personally guaranteed loans that were about to come due. He wanted to force a foreclosure, I said finally. Buy the debt, accelerate the loan, force the owner to sell to cover it. Dante's smile was approving. Could the owner challenge it legally? Not if we did it right, I told him. The personal guarantee was ironclad. But I hesitated. He waited. This would ruin the owner, I said. Financially, politically, everything. Marco pulled up a file on his phone, showed me a photo. The property owner, David Morrison, standing with his family outside the building. 2 kids, maybe 8 and 10. His wife had her arm around him, all of them smiling. He has a family, I said quietly. Dante asked if that was a legal concern or a moral one. His voice was neutral, but his eyes were watching me carefully. I looked at the documents again, at the photo, at the choice I was making. I pushed the phone away. Legal concern only, I said. Then I told him exactly how to do it. But that night, I couldn't stop seeing that photograph. Couldn't stop wondering what would happen to those kids when their father lost everything. Couldn't stop thinking about my own father and whether someone had shown him this same kind of mercy before the end. They hadn't. Chapter 4, Complications. 3 weeks later, I'd handled 4 more jobs for Dante. Corporate restructuring to hide assets. Contract reviews for businesses I suspected were fronts. Real estate transactions that pushed the boundaries of legality. Each time I told myself it was temporary, that I was just surviving, that I'd walk away once the debt was clear. But something else was happening, something I didn't want to acknowledge. I was good at this. Better than I was at drafting corporate merger documents or reviewing SEC filings. There was a thrill in finding the legal loopholes, in outsmarting the system. And Dante noticed. One night, after I'd successfully restructured one of his shell corporations to avoid federal scrutiny, he told me I was wasted at my firm. I should be doing this full time. I reminded him I was a lawyer, not a criminal. He asked if there was a difference. He was joking, mostly. We were in his office, a sleek penthouse in Midtown with views of the entire city. It was late, nearly 10 p.m. I should have left hours ago. I asked him suddenly why he did this. He was clearly intelligent, educated, he could do anything. He turned the question back on me. Yale Law, top of my class, and I was drowning in debt working for partners who didn't appreciate me. We weren't so different, he said. We both saw an opportunity and took it. We both operated in moral gray areas. We both knew the rules were written by people who already won the game. The only difference was honesty. He didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. I should have argued, should have defended my choices, my career, my integrity. Instead, I accepted the bourbon he poured. I asked him something I'd been wondering. When this was over, when the debt was paid, would he actually let me walk away? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked if I wanted to walk away. I told him I hadn't decided yet. Then neither had he said. The air between us shifted, charged with something dangerous, something I shouldn't want but couldn't quite resist. My phone buzzed. Emergency text from my firm. They needed me in the office immediately. The spell broke. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. Dante's voice stopped me. He told me to be careful. My firm was asking questions about my outside consulting. Someone had noticed the Mercedes picking me up. Cold dread settled in my stomach. I asked what I should do. He told me to do what I did best. Lie convincingly. But this was getting complicated, he said. We needed to be more careful. I nodded and left, my mind racing. I was in deeper than I'd intended. The debt was one thing, but this, whatever this was between Dante and me, was something else entirely. Something that could destroy everything. Chapter 5. Broken Promises. 2 days later, I was called into the senior partner's office. Michael Harrison was in his 60s, silver-haired, sharp as broken glass. He'd built the firm from nothing and had a reputation for crushing anyone who threatened it. He told me to sit. Then he was direct. There were concerns about my conduct, late nights, mysterious clients, unexplained absences. Was I doing work for someone outside the firm? I had student loans, I explained. I took freelance consulting work occasionally. It was allowed under my contract. He asked if I was consulting for organized crime figures. My blood went cold. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. He told me not to insult his intelligence. Dante Russo. I'd been seen with him multiple times. Did I understand what that association could do to the firm's reputation? I said I was handling a family matter. My father had owed money. I was resolving it legally. By becoming Russo's attorney, he asked. He gave me 2 choices. End whatever relationship I had with Russo, immediately, or resign from the firm. I tried to argue that he couldn't force me to. He could and he was, he interrupted. The firm's integrity was non-negotiable. I had until Monday to decide. I walked out of his office and made it exactly 3 blocks before the rage hit. Dante had promised this wouldn't affect my career, had assured me it would be discreet, contained, invisible. He'd looked me in the eye and told me my bar license was safe. My job was secure. He'd lied. 3 weeks. I'd been working for him for 3 weeks, and I was already being threatened with termination, with the end of everything I'd worked for. I pulled out my phone and called him. He answered on the first ring. I didn't let him speak. I told him exactly what I thought, that he was a liar, that he'd promised this wouldn't compromise my career and I was getting fired, that I should have never trusted a word that came out of his mouth. There was silence on the other end. Then he asked where I was. I told him it didn't matter, that we were done, that I'd find another way to pay the debt, or I'd let him take everything I owned, but I wasn't doing this anymore. He told me to meet him at Vesper, 1 hour, he could explain. I told him there was nothing to explain. He'd lied, and I was done. He said my name, just once, quietly. Then, please. The word caught me off guard. Men like Dante Russo didn't say please, didn't ask, they commanded. I told him he had 30 minutes, not an hour, 30, and if his explanation wasn't good enough, I was walking away and he'd never see me again. I hung up before he could respond. Chapter 6. The Offer. I arrived at Vesper 28 minutes later, still furious. Dante was waiting in the same private room where this had all started. He stood when I entered, but I didn't sit down. I told him he had promised me this wouldn't affect my career, that my work with him would be separate, discreet, invisible, and now I was being threatened with termination after 3 weeks. He admitted that Harrison had moved faster than expected, that he should have been more careful about the Mercedes, about the visibility. I asked if that was supposed to be an apology. No, he said, it wasn't. He didn't apologize for things that were necessary. That made me even angrier. I asked him how any of this was necessary, how destroying my career was part of whatever plan he had. He told me to sit down. We needed to talk about options. I told him I was done taking orders from him, done sitting when he told me to sit, done doing his work, done with all of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me there was another option, one I hadn't considered. I waited, arms crossed, still standing. He offered me a position, full-time working for him, not as outside counsel but as his partner. He'd clear my father's debt entirely. He'd pay me double what my firm did, and I'd have real power, real influence. I stared at him, asked if he was serious. Completely, he said. I was brilliant. I was wasted playing by their rules. He could give me everything. Freedom, power, purpose. I told him he was insane, that I couldn't trust him. That 3 weeks ago he'd promised my career was safe, and now I was getting fired. How could I possibly trust him enough to give up everything and work for him exclusively? He said he understood my anger, but the firm was going to fire me regardless. Harrison had already made up his mind. The question wasn't whether I'd lose that job, it was what I did next. I told him he didn't get to act like he was helping me when he'd created the problem in the first place. He didn't argue with that. Just asked what I wanted. To go back to a firm that was about to fire me. To spend the next decade in debt, working for partners who'd blacklist me the moment I left. Or to take a risk on something bigger. I asked why I should believe anything he said. He'd broken his first promise within weeks. What made his new promises any more reliable? Because this time, he said, there was nothing to hide. I wouldn't be splitting my loyalty between two worlds. I'd be all in. And so would he. Partners shared risk, shared consequences. I told him I needed time to think. He said I had 24 hours. After that, the offer expired. I turned to leave, then stopped at the door. Asked him one more question. Did he regret lying to me? Did he regret the promise he'd broken? He met my eyes. Told me he regretted that I got hurt, but he didn't regret the work I'd done, and he wouldn't lie. If he had to make the same choice again, he'd make it, because the work mattered more than my comfort. At least he was honest about being dishonest. I left without another word, still angry, still uncertain, still feeling the weight of a choice I didn't want to make. Epilogue, the decision. I spent that night walking the city, trying to think clearly through the rage. Every rational part of me screamed to walk away, to let Dante and my father's debt and all of it burn while I started over somewhere else. But another part, the part that had tasted power and strategy and the thrill of winning, was already calculating, already seeing past the anger to the possibilities. At 3 a.m, I stood outside Vesper, staring at my reflection in the dark glass. Who was I? The dutiful daughter paying a dead man's debts, the ambitious lawyer clinging to a career that was already over. Or someone else entirely, someone who could thrive in the shadows, who could match Dante move for move, who could turn betrayal into opportunity. My phone buzzed, a text from Dante. It said my time was almost up, but before I decided, I should know something. My firm was planning to report me to the Bar Association on Monday. Harrison didn't just want me fired, he wanted me destroyed. Dante could make that disappear, but only if I was with him. My hands shook as I read the message. Another manipulation, another way of controlling the situation, another lie wrapped in truth. But also accurate, also useful, also exactly the kind of information a partner would share. I looked up at the building where Dante was probably waiting, where my answer would determine everything that came next. Some people say the worst decisions are made in desperation. Others say the best ones are made in anger. I was about to find out which one was right.